March 11th, 1918, 2:30 in the morning, somewhere in the chalky mud between Arras and Lens, France. Lance Corporal William Underhill of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, is about to commit murder with his bare hands. He lies motionless in a shell crater, face pressed into earth that reeks of cordite and decomposition, watching the silhouette of a German sentry 20 yards away. The man is smoking. The cigarette's ember glows orange in the darkness, a tiny lighthouse in an ocean of blackness. Underhill can hear the German humming something, a tune he doesn't recognize. In 4 minutes, that man will be dead. His throat opened by the sharpened entrenching tool now gripped in Underhill's trembling fist. In 7 minutes, Underhill and 3 other raiders will be sprinting back toward British lines with a wounded prisoner, grenades exploding behind them, machine gun fire tearing the air into fragments. In 12 minutes, Underhill will be vomiting into a latrine trench, hands still shaking, unable to process what he has just done in the name of gathering intelligence. But right now, at this precise moment, he is still innocent, still clean. The sentry takes another drag. The ember brightens, and the distance between peace and violence narrows to nothing. This is not battle as the world understood it in 1914. This is something else entirely. Something that would transform modern warfare forever and leave psychological scars on an entire generation that no treaty could heal. Act 1. The Birth of Nightmares. When the Western Front calcified into static trench lines in the autumn of 1914, military commanders on both sides believed they understood the nature of this new war. Battles would be fought with artillery bombardments followed by massed infantry assaults. Intelligence would come from aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogation after major offensives. The space between the trenches, that blasted moonscape of craters and wire that soldiers began calling no man's land, was simply dead ground. A killing zone to be crossed during attacks, but otherwise empty, meaningless. A void. They were catastrophically wrong. The distance between opposing trench systems varied wildly along the Western Front. Near Vimy Ridge, some positions sat more than 800 yards apart. At Zonnebeek in the Ypres salient, German and British trenches narrowed to less than 50 yards, close enough that soldiers could hear enemies coughing, smell their cooking, even distinguish individual voices in the darkness. This proximity created an intelligence problem that conventional military doctrine had never addressed. Commanders needed information constantly: enemy strength, defensive preparations, morale, the effectiveness of artillery bombardment, the location of machine gun nests and trench mortar positions. They needed it not monthly or weekly, but daily, and they needed it without launching full-scale assaults that would cost thousands of lives. The solution emerged not from staff colleges or tactical manuals, but from the ranks themselves. From junior officers and senior non-commissioned officers who understood that the darkness offered opportunities that daylight foreclosed. From men willing to crawl into the void and do terrible things in silence. The first organized trench raids were crude, almost experimental affairs. In February 1915, Canadian troops near Neuve-Chapelle began sending small parties into no man's land to probe German wire and listening posts. These early efforts were often disastrous. Men became entangled in wire and were cut down by machine gun fire. Grenades exploded prematurely, killing the throwers. Raiders became disoriented in the darkness and stumbled into their own minefields. But gradually, through trial and error measured in blood, a new form of combat emerged, one that required skills no peacetime army had ever taught. Private Arthur Empey, an American volunteer serving with the British Army, described his first raid briefing in the winter of 1916. The officer spread a trench map on the fire step, Empey would later write. He pointed to a section of German trench marked in red. "Intelligence believes there's a listening post here," he said. "We need to know what unit is holding this sector. We need a prisoner, a live one." He looked at us then, and I remember thinking his eyes were dead. Absolutely dead. You'll go over at 0300. You'll have 40 minutes. The artillery will give you covering fire on the flanks, but the center will be silent. We don't want them alerted. When you reach their wire, cut through quietly. Kill the sentries with blades only. No rifles, no grenades until you're coming back. Grab the first man you can and bring him here. Questions. No one spoke. What could we ask? We were being sent to do murder in the dark, and questions seemed somehow beside the point. The first successful raids yielded immediate results. Prisoners provided identification of opposing units, allowing intelligence officers to map the entire order of battle along a sector. Documents taken from corpses revealed defensive schemes and rotation schedules. Physical evidence of enemy morale, the quality of their rations, the condition of their equipment, gave commanders insights no aerial photograph could provide. Within months, trench raids evolved from opportunistic ventures into systematic operations, planned with the precision of conventional attacks but executed on a miniature, nightmarish scale. By late 1916, every division on the Western Front conducted regular raids. Frequency varied by sector and circumstance, but active areas saw multiple raids per week. Some divisions raided nearly every night. The pressure was relentless. Staff officers demanded results. Prisoners, intelligence, proof of aggression. And the men who went into the darkness paid the price. Act 2. The machinery of night terror. The transformation of trench raids from improvised skirmishes into industrial-scale terror operations required new weapons, new tactics, and a new kind of soldier. The British Army established dedicated raiding schools behind the lines where officers and men trained for weeks in mock trenches, learning skills that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. How to move silently across broken ground in darkness. How to kill with knives, clubs, and sharpened entrenching tools. How to navigate by compass and dead reckoning when landmarks vanished in smoke and darkness. How to throw grenades with precision and timing. How to maintain unit cohesion when visibility dropped to arm's length. How to distinguish friend from enemy when everyone was covered in mud and blood and uniforms meant nothing in the dark. The weapons of raiding parties reflected the intimate violence of their mission. Lee Enfield rifles were often left behind, too long and cumbersome for close-quarters work. Instead, raiders carried sawed-off shotguns, revolvers, and automatic pistols. Grenades became the primary weapon. The British Mills bomb, weighing 1 pound 6 ounces with a 4-second fuse, could be thrown 30 yards by a trained man. Raiders carried them in canvas buckets, a dozen or more per man, hanging from belts and shoulder straps like deadly fruit. German stick grenades, with their distinctive wooden handles, flew farther but had less fragmentation effect. Both sides developed specialized weapons for trench fighting. The British manufactured metal knuckle dusters with attached blades. Trench clubs, studded with nails or wrapped in barbed wire, appeared in workshops behind the lines. Some were works of craftsmanship, carved from hardwood and balanced like medieval maces. Others were simply lengths of pipe filled with concrete. The most feared weapon in a raider's arsenal was not a weapon at all, but a man. Each raiding party included designated killers, soldiers selected for their physical strength, ruthlessness, and ability to kill silently with blade or garrote. These men received extra rum rations before raids and extra leave afterward. They were quietly praised by officers and equally quietly shunned by some of their comrades. They had crossed a line that even the industrial slaughter of conventional battle did not require. They had killed men while looking into their faces. They had felt breath stop and muscles go slack. They carried that knowledge in ways artillery crews and machine gunners never would. Lieutenant Ernst Junger, serving with the 73rd Hanoverian Fusiliers, described the psychological preparation for a raid in his memoir Storm of Steel. "We blackened our faces with burnt cork," Junger wrote. "We removed all insignia, all identification. Wedding rings, letters, photographs, anything that might give information to the enemy if we were killed or captured. We became anonymous, nameless, and in becoming nameless we became capable of things that our named selves could not contemplate. The officer leading us was a man who in peacetime had been a school teacher. Now he was explaining how to kill sentries from behind, where to grip, how to twist, to break the neck cleanly. He spoke in a calm, pedagogical tone, as if teaching mathematics. Perhaps this made it easier. Perhaps it made it worse. I could not then and cannot now decide. The raids themselves followed a brutal pattern that varied little whether launched by British, French, German, Canadian, or Australian troops. They began hours before dawn, in the darkest portion of night when sentries were most exhausted and least alert. Artillery would open fire on enemy positions several hundred yards distant from the target, creating noise and distraction. Under this covering bombardment, the raiding party would crawl over the parapet and into no man's land. Movement was measured in yards per hour. A 200-yard crawl to enemy wire might take 90 minutes. Every shell crater became a temporary refuge. Every intact stretch of barbed wire, a potential death trap. Wire cutting was an art form. Rushed cutting produced metallic sounds that carried clearly in the still night air. Alerted sentries would fire flares, and machine guns would rake no man's land with traversing fire, killing everyone caught in the open. Skilled raiders cut wire strand by strand, slowly, carefully, creating gaps just wide enough to slip through. They worked in pairs, one man cutting while another watched and listened. The psychological strain was immense. Men held their breath for minutes at a time. Hearts hammered so loudly that soldiers later swore enemies must have heard them. Once through the wire, raiders faced the final approach. 20 yards. 15. 10. Close enough now to hear breathing, to smell tobacco and unwashed bodies. Here, hesitation meant death. Sentries had to be killed instantly, silently, before they could shout warnings or fire weapons. The techniques were brutal. Blade under the jaw, angled upward into the brain. Garrote from behind, crushing the windpipe. Skull crushed with a club. Throat opened with a sharpened entrenching tool. The Germans developed a particular technique using wire garrotes with wooden handles, twisted until the wire cut completely through the neck. Bodies were lowered silently into trenches or pulled into craters. Then came the penetration. Raiders dropped into enemy trenches and moved with frantic speed through the labyrinth. They threw grenades into dugouts, killing or stunning defenders before they could organize resistance. They grabbed wounded or stunned soldiers and began the retreat. Supporting parties with more grenades covered the withdrawal. Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes filled with explosives, were used to blast gaps in wire if the raiders needed to return by a different route than they had arrived. The covering artillery, silent during the approach, now erupted with maximum violence, placing a barrier of explosions between the raiders and pursuing enemies. The return across no man's land was the most dangerous phase. Adrenaline and fear drove men to move too quickly, to stand when they should crawl, to bunch together when they should spread out. German machine guns, now fully alert, fired predetermined barrages across likely approach routes. Raiders carrying wounded comrades or struggling prisoners became easy targets. Casualties during the withdrawal often exceeded those suffered during the raid itself. Men who had survived the attack, who had killed enemies and seized objectives, died yards from their own trenches, shot in the back while climbing their own parapets. The statistics reveal the scale. British forces conducted approximately 1,700 major trench raids between early 1916 and the armistice in November 1918. Thousands more smaller patrols penetrated no man's land. Canadian Corps alone launched over 5,000 raids and aggressive patrols. German forces were equally active. French records are incomplete but suggest comparable numbers. Conservatively, across all armies on the Western Front, At least 20,000 organized raids took place during the war. Casualties per raid varied wildly. Small patrols might return with no losses. Major raids involving 50 or more men could suffer 30% casualties or higher. A successful raid bringing back 2 or 3 prisoners might cost 10 friendly dead and 20 wounded. The arithmetic was brutal, but military logic considered it sound. 10 casualties to capture 3 prisoners and identify an enemy division was cheaper than a conventional attack that might cost hundreds or thousands of lives to gain the same intelligence. Raids kept enemy forces on constant alert, degrading their morale and preventing rest. They allowed junior officers and sergeants to gain combat experience in relatively controlled circumstances. They maintained what military theorists called the offensive spirit, even during periods of static warfare. And perhaps most importantly, they gathered intelligence that shaped larger operations. The success of the Canadian assault on Vimy Ridge in April 1917 depended heavily on intelligence gathered during months of systematic raiding. British gains during the 100 Days Offensive in late 1918 were guided by prisoner interrogations from hundreds of previous raids. But the cost cannot be measured only in casualty lists. Act 3. The Price of Darkness. By 1917, raiding had become a permanent feature of trench warfare, expected and dreaded in equal measure. Veterans could recognize the signs of an impending raid hours before it launched: increased artillery activity on the flanks, unusual movements in forward trenches, officers and sergeants conferring in tense huddles, the sharp smell of rum being distributed to men about to go over, and throughout the front line, a collective anxiety that infected everyone, raiders and garrison troops alike. Sergeant Frederick Noakes of the 8th Battalion, Royal West Surrey Regiment, kept a diary that was discovered decades after his death. His entry from July 22, 1917, captures the psychological weight. "We raid tonight," Noakes wrote. "Lieutenant Crawford volunteered our section. He asked for volunteers first, but when no hands went up, he picked us anyway. Said it was our turn. Mathematical, like. Every section has to go eventually. Fair, I suppose. Though fairness seems a word from another life. We know the plan. Over at 0200. 50 yards to their wire. Cut through. Drop into their trench. Grab whoever we can. Back before dawn. Simple. Except nothing is simple, and we all know it. Jenkins keeps touching a photograph of his wife. Williams is sharpening his bayonet over and over, though it's already sharp as a razor. I can hear my own heartbeat. I can hear everyone's heartbeat. Or maybe that's artillery. Hard to tell anymore what's inside my head and what's outside it." The psychological impact of raiding extended far beyond those who participated. Every man in the trenches knew that enemy raiders might come for him any night. Sentries stared into darkness until their eyes created phantoms. Every sound became a threat. Every shadow harbored death. The Germans developed increasingly sophisticated early warning systems, tripwires connected to flares and bells, listening posts pushed far forward into no man's land, manned by soldiers equipped with directional microphones. Barbed wire barriers grew thicker and more complex, reaching depths of 40 feet in some sectors. Machine gun positions were sited specifically to cover approaches likely to be used by raiders. Artillery was registered on gaps in wire and shell craters that offered cover. The escalation became self-reinforcing. As defenses improved, raids required more men, more supporting fire, more elaborate planning. Casualties increased. As casualties increased, the pressure to make raids worthwhile intensified. Commanders demanded not just 1 or 2 prisoners, but 4 or 5. Not just identification, but documents, maps, anything that justified the blood spent. Raiders pushed deeper into enemy positions, penetrating second and third line trenches. They destroyed dugouts, captured weapons, planted mines with delayed fuses. Operations that began as intelligence-gathering missions became miniature battles. The Canadians, particularly, developed raiding into a scientific doctrine. Major General Arthur Currie, commanding the Canadian Corps, mandated systematic raids across his entire front. Training became standardized. Tactics were refined through analysis of after-action reports. Specialized equipment was manufactured. Mock German trenches were built behind Canadian lines, complete with wire obstacles and dugouts, where raiding parties rehearsed attacks until every man knew his role precisely. The raids became larger, involving 50 to 100 men supported by artillery barrages that mimicked those used in major offensives. Casualties rose proportionally. A Canadian raid on German positions near Lens in May 1917 involved 70 men and suffered 26 killed and wounded. The raid captured 4 prisoners and identified 2 German divisions. By the arithmetic of war, it was judged a success. But something was breaking in the men who survived these operations repeatedly. Medical officers began reporting cases they termed neurasthenia and shell shock in soldiers who had never been in major battles but who had participated in multiple raids. The symptoms were distinctive: uncontrollable trembling, inability to sleep, violent nightmares, flashbacks triggered by darkness or sudden noises. Some men became unable to bear physical contact, others could not tolerate being alone. Captain Charles Myers, a psychologist serving with the Royal Army Medical Corps, interviewed dozens of raiders suffering psychological collapse. His reports, classified during the war and only released decades later, make for harrowing reading. The raider exists in a state of sustained terror unlike anything experienced by soldiers in conventional battle, Myers wrote. In battle, the soldier is surrounded by comrades. The noise and chaos create a kind of dissociative state that provides psychological protection. But the raider operates in silence and darkness, fully conscious, acutely aware of every action. He must simultaneously navigate, fight, kill at close quarters, and maintain operational discipline. The cognitive load is immense. Many of the men I have interviewed report feeling that they became someone else during raids, a stranger inhabiting their body. They describe watching themselves commit acts of violence as if from outside, as spectators to their own actions. The dissociation is protective in the moment but corrosive over time. These men cannot reconcile the civilized person they believe themselves to be with the killer they became in the darkness. The contradiction destroys them. The Germans suffered equivalently. Oberarzt Karl Bonhoeffer, a military psychiatrist treating German soldiers, documented similar cases. His reports describe men who became mute, unable or unwilling to speak about their experiences. Others developed elaborate compulsions, checking and rechecking weapons and equipment endlessly, unable to trust that anything was prepared correctly. Some became violent, attacking comrades in their sleep. Bonhoeffer concluded that close-quarters night combat produced psychological casualties at rates comparable to sustained artillery bombardment, perhaps higher. Yet the raids continued. They continued because they worked, because the intelligence they provided was genuinely valuable, because commanders believed they maintained offensive spirit and fighting edge, because stopping them would have seemed like weakness, like ceding the initiative to the enemy. And so men kept going over the parapet and into the darkness, night after night after night. Lance Corporal William Underhill, who opened this narrative, survived the war. He participated in 11 raids between March 1918 and November of the same year. His service record notes that he was awarded the Military Medal for Gallantry in the Field following a raid near Cambrai in September 1918. The citation provides no details. Underhill never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences. He returned to his pre-war occupation as a postal clerk in Birmingham. He married. He had 3 children. And in 1941, 2 years after Britain entered its second war with Germany, William Underhill walked into his garden shed and hanged himself with a length of rope. He was 47 years old. His suicide note, preserved in family papers, consisted of a single sentence: "I am still in no man's land." Epilogue. The Memory of Darkness. The armistice of November 11th, 1918, ended the fighting but not the nightmares. Veterans of trench raids returned to civilian life, carrying memories that civilian society had no framework to process. In an era that understood physical wounds but not psychological ones, that valorized courage but pathologized trauma, many suffered in silence. Some self-medicated with alcohol, others withdrew into isolation. A disturbing number, like William Underhill, eventually chose suicide. Exact statistics do not exist. The shame and stigma surrounding both mental illness and suicide ensured that many cases went unrecorded or were attributed to other causes. But historians examining interwar suicide rates among veterans have identified patterns suggesting that raiders suffered disproportionately. The military lessons of trench raiding, however, were learned and retained. The tactics and skills developed in the darkness of no man's land directly influenced the formation of elite infantry units and special operations forces in subsequent conflicts. British commandos in World War II traced their conceptual lineage to First World War raiding parties. American Rangers studied trench raid after-action reports as part of their training. German Fallschirmjäger and Soviet Red Army Scouts incorporated techniques refined between the trenches. The nighttime infiltration tactics used by Israeli special forces, by Viet Cong sappers, by countless irregular forces worldwide, all echo the methods pioneered in the mud of France and Belgium between 1914 and 1918. In 1976, a group of Canadian military historians conducted oral history interviews with surviving veterans of the Western Front. Few men who had participated in trench raids were still alive by then, and fewer still were willing to discuss their experiences. But one interview stands out. Former Sergeant Malcolm Stewart, 91 years old, who had led 16 raids as a young non-commissioned officer with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, finally spoke about what he had endured 60 years earlier. "People ask me about the war sometimes," Stewart said. "They want to know about the battles, the Somme, Passchendaele, the big names, but the raids were worse, much worse. In battle, you're acting on orders in daylight with thousands of other men doing the same thing. The responsibility is diffused, shared. But in a raid, it's personal, intimate. You're not firing into a mass of enemies at a distance. You're putting your hands on another human being and ending his life. You're looking into his eyes. You're hearing his last breath. And you're doing it not in self-defense, not in the heat of battle, but coldly, deliberately, because you were ordered to do so." Stewart paused for a long moment. The interviewer waited. Finally, Stewart continued, "I remember every man I killed in those raids. Every single one. I can see their faces now, clear as day. More clearly than I can see my own grandchildren's faces, if I'm honest. That's what people don't understand about that kind of warfare. It doesn't end. You think the armistice means it's over, but it's not over. It never ends. Those men are still dying. I'm still killing them. Every night when I close my eyes, I'm back there in the darkness, still crawling through the wire, still waiting for the sentry to turn, still preparing to do terrible things because an officer told me it was necessary." He looked directly at the camera then, and his next words were barely audible. "Was it necessary? Did those raids change anything? We won the war, but we would have won anyway. The Americans were coming. Germany was collapsing. So what did it all mean? I killed 16 men with my own hands. 16 men who had mothers and perhaps wives and children. What was the point of that? Can anyone tell me what the point of that was?" The interviewer had no answer. History has no answer. The military historians who analyzed the data concluded that trench raids contributed incrementally to Allied victory by providing tactical intelligence and maintaining pressure on German forces. The cost-benefit analysis, viewed coldly, suggests the raids were justified within the context of total war. But cold analysis cannot account for William Underhill in his garden shed, or Malcolm Stewart's unanswerable questions, or the thousands of other men who carried darkness inside them for the rest of their lives. No Man's Land raids represented a transformation in warfare that military theorists are still processing. They demonstrated that in modern industrial war, the line between combatant and assassin, between soldier and murderer, becomes blurred beyond distinction. They showed that technology and tactics could create situations where men were required to do things that shattered them psychologically, even when they did those things successfully. They proved that victory could be achieved through methods that destroyed the victors as surely as the vanquished. Today, along the former Western Front, the land has healed. Forests have grown. Fields produce crops. Towns have been rebuilt. But if you walk the old front lines at night, in the darkness between midnight and dawn, veterans claimed you could still hear echoes. The soft sound of wire being cut, the crunch of boots on duckboards, the muffled thump of grenades, the brief cries quickly silenced. These are not supernatural phenomena. They are memory. They are the weight of history that some ground never fully releases. They are the legacy of 4 years when tens of thousands of men went into darkness and did unspeakable things because war required it. Some came back. All were changed. None were whole. And in the end, perhaps that is the only lesson that matters. That war creates necessities that destroy the men who fulfill them. That courage and trauma are inseparable. That victory and loss become indistinguishable when measured in human cost. That the raids into no man's land, whatever their tactical value, represented a descent into darkness from which an entire generation never fully emerged. The veterans understood this. The survivors who carried their burden in silence understood this. And now, more than a century later, as we study their experiences and try to extract meaning from their sacrifice, we must understand it too. Not to glorify, not to condemn, but to remember fully and honestly what was done, what was lost, and what darkness men are capable of enduring when their nations demand it. The ember of the sentry's cigarette glows orange in the darkness. Lance Corporal Underhill watches it from his shell crater. The distance between them narrows, and the past becomes present, and the present becomes eternal, and the darkness of no man's land extends forward through time, unending, unforgotten, forever.